Deep in Black Pine National Wildlife Refuge, an old ranger named Walt Mitchell lived a life most would call lonely. For 30 years, he patrolled these woods. No wife, no children, just the whisper of pines and the occasional growl of a mountain lion. But the animals? They knew him. Some say he could calm a charging bear with just his eyes. This is the story they don't put in park brochures. The story of how a man who spoke no words understood every cry in the dark. Walt's cedar cabin creaked with every storm, its walls lined with maps and faded photos of animals he'd saved. The other rangers called him Ghost. Not unfriendly, just because he moved so quiet, like the mist over Silver Creek. He preferred it that way. Solitude suited him, until one rain-soaked evening, when the forest screamed in a way he'd never heard before, and Walt Mitchell realized, for the first time in decades, he wasn't alone out here. Most men would have gone mad with the silence. Not Walt. He marked his days by the scrape of eagle wings on dawn patrols, the grumble of distant thunder. His only confidant, an old AM radio crackling with static. But then, the wind carried something new, a sound too raw to ignore. Not the cry of prey, but of something proud, broken, and begging for help. Walt tightened his raincoat and stepped into the storm. The bushes trembled. Walt froze. There, in the mud beside Silver Creek, lay a young mountain lion, muscle and fury, its golden eyes glazed with pain. A gash on its leg festered with infection. Flies swarmed, no tracks around it. The pack had left it to die. The lion bared its teeth, but Walt saw the truth. This wasn't a snarl. It was a plea. And in that moment, the old ranger made a choice that would tie their souls together forever. Lightning split the sky. The lion, King Walt would later name him, shuddered as cold rain hit the wound. No time for gloves. Walt crouched, hands open, murmuring low like he did to spooked foals back in his ranch days. One sudden move, and those razor claws could have ripped his throat out. But the lion didn't fight. It watched, as if recognizing the one man in Montana reckless enough or kind enough to touch a dying predator. Blood soaked Walt's sleeves as he packed the wound with moss. The lion's breath came in wet, ragged gasps. No time for the station. Walt hauled 90 pounds of muscle onto his back, boots sinking in mud. Halfway to the truck, King's head lolled against his shoulder. A whisper of warmth. Not an attack, a trust fall. And Walt, who hadn't held anything living in years, felt something crack deep in his chest. The Black Pine Wildlife Clinic smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. Dr. Laura Simmons, the no-nonsense vet, didn't flinch at the big cat on her table. "You're lucky," she said, stitching the wound. "Cougars usually eat good Samaritans." Walt said nothing, just watched King's ribs rise and fall. Then, the lion's paw twitched. Its eyes opened, and for a heartbeat, man and beast understood each other perfectly. "You saved me. Now what?" 3 weeks later, King paced a recovery pen beside Walt's cabin. The ranger sat cross-legged in the dirt, tossing chunks of venison through the bars. "Eat up, Your Highness," he muttered. The lion ignored the meat, just stared, like it was memorizing Walt's face. The vet warned, "Wild things don't thank you." But that night, as Walt turned to leave, a sound stopped him. A low, rough noise, almost a purr, rumbling from the shadows. Infection set in. King refused to eat. Walt stayed up, pressing cool rags to the feverish fur. "Stubborn cat," he grumbled. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the old ranger did something he hadn't done since his mother's funeral. He prayed, not to God, to the woods, to whatever forces let a lonely man and a broken lion find each other. At dawn, King licked Walt's palm, and the ranger, tough as old boots, wept. The station crew shook their heads. "That cat'll kill you someday, Walt," warned Trapper Rick. But Walt just smirked. Every morning, he'd sit by King's cage, reading aloud from his dog-eared John Muir books. The lion's ears would tilt, like he was listening, Then came the day King leaned his full weight against the bars, not to attack. To lean, as if to say, I'm here, I remember. And in that quiet, something wild and wonderful took root between them. The first time Walt changed King's bandages alone, his hands shook. That powerful head could snap his arm like a twig. But the lion just exhaled sharply and laid still, like he knew, like he was saying, I won't hurt you, old man. Walt's breath caught. After 30 years of fearing claws and fangs, here he was, pressing gauze to a predator's wound, and feeling safer than he had in decades. Infection ran deep. The wound needed cleaning. King's muscles trembled as Walt worked, those yellow eyes squeezed shut. Then, something miraculous. The lion's massive head dropped onto Walt's lap. Not to bite, to rest. The ranger's calloused fingers paused. This creature that could kill him with one swipe was trusting him with its vulnerability. In that moment, Walt Mitchell, a man who'd forgotten how to cry, felt hot tears melt into golden fur. The storm returned with vengeance. Trees thrashed like living things. King's fever spiked. Walt grabbed the radio. Static. No vet, no help. Just an old man and a dying lion in a tin-roofed shed. Walt did the only thing left. He wrapped his arms around that heaving body, humming an old cowboy tune his daddy used to sing. The lion's breathing slowed. Outside, the world raged. Inside, two hearts beat against the storm. Morning came. King wouldn't stand. Walt, at 68 years old, lifted 110 pounds of mountain lion into his truck bed. No cage, just blankets and faith. As they bounced down the mountain road, King's paw rested on Walt's shoulder through the cab window. Not a threat, an anchor, the ranger whispered. Not today, your majesty. Whether to the lion or the reaper, even Walt didn't know. The clinic lights burned all night. Dr. Simmons worked silently while Walt paced. At 3:17 a.m., she emerged. He'll live. Walt collapsed into a chair. Later, alone with the sleeping lion, he stroked that battle-scarred head and made a promise. You'll run free again. Then, the impossible. King's tail twitched, like he'd heard, like he understood. And maybe, in some way beyond human knowing, he did. Winter bit hard that year. Walt woke to frost on his cabin windows and immediately thought of King. He trudged through snow to the recovery pen, his grandmother's quilt in hand. The lion watched, breath steaming, as Walt spread the faded fabric over him. That night, for the first time in memory, Walt left his door cracked open, just in case. Some bonds, even blizzards can't freeze. Names have power. Walt knew this when he christened the lion. King, he announced, tossing a rabbit into the pen. One ear flicked. The ranger grinned. Yeah, you like that, don't you? What happened next stunned the watching rangers. King, the wild mountain lion, chuffed. A sound so close to laughter, Walt's knees went weak. In that moment, a name became an identity. And an identity. Flu laid Walt flat for 2 days. On the second night, a sound shattered the darkness. King's roar, louder than any storm. Closer. The rangers found the lion ramming the pen gate, eyes wild. Then they saw why Walt's cabin light was dark. When they checked, they found the old man burning with fever. King stopped roaring only when Walt's voice croaked from the bed. I'm here, boy. The lion's answering whimper sounded almost human. Spring came. Walt would sit for hours by King's pen, neither speaking nor moving, just being. Sometimes the lion would press against the bars until his fur indented the wire. Other times they'd simply watch hawks circle. No need for words. The young rangers whispered about it, how the old man and the beast seemed to share thoughts. But Walt knew the truth. Some connections transcend language. They live in the spaces between heartbeats. The day arrived. King paced his pen, muscle and power restored. Dr. Simmons nodded. He's ready. Walt's fingers trembled as he unlatched the gate. This creature who'd become his shadow, his confidant, his reason to rise before dawn, would walk away. The ranger took a breath, stepped back, and whispered the hardest word he'd ever spoken, "Go!" King hesitated. Those golden eyes searched Walt's face, as if memorizing every wrinkle. Then, he vanished into the pines. The heavy gate creaked on its hinges. King stood motionless at the threshold, muscles taut, nostrils flaring with new forest scents. His golden eyes flicked back to Walt. Just for a second. A heartbeat. The old ranger held his breath. Then, a twitch of that magnificent tail. King took his first step toward freedom. Walt's chest ached. That hesitation, that fleeting glance told him everything. Some bonds even the wild can't break. Walt reached out one final time. His gnarled fingers found that familiar spot behind King's ear. The lion leaned into the touch, rumbling deep in his chest. Then a distant sound, a rustle in the aspens. King's head snapped up. Instinct called. With a last nudge against Walt's shoulder, he melted into the trees. The ranger stood frozen, hands still outstretched, the ghost of warmth fading from his fingertips. The forest swallowed them both, one in body, one in spirit. The clearing stood empty, silent. Walt clutched the red-plaid scarf he'd used to wipe King's muzzle that morning. It still carried the musky scent of lion. His knees buckled. 30 years alone, and now he knew what missing felt like. The wind stirred the pines overhead, carrying away the last traces of paw prints. Walt Mitchell, the man who never needed anyone, suddenly understood why people kept dogs. Why they needed someone to come home to. Dawn painted the mountains in pinks and golds. Walt shuffled to his porch with coffee, like every morning. Then a sound he'd dreamed of, a low, familiar chuff from the tree line. His cup slipped, shattering on the steps. There, just beyond the fence, sat King, larger now, mane thicker, but those eyes. Those same knowing eyes. The lion blinked slowly. Walt's voice cracked on a single word. "You!" And in that moment, the cabin wasn't empty anymore. It became their ritual. Every few weeks, before first light, a roar would echo through the valley. Walt would wake with a start, pulling on his boots before his eyes fully opened. There'd be King waiting by the old fence line. No rushing, no demands, just presence. The rangers joked Walt had a sixth sense. He'd start cooking extra meat minutes before the lion appeared. But Walt knew the truth. Some connections don't fade. They simply change shape with time. Seasons turned. King's visits remained steady as the North Star. He'd arrive at dawn, sit tall by the boundary, and wait. Walt would bring venison, talking softly about trail repairs and pesky tourists. The lion would listen, ears swiveling, as if storing each word. Then, as the sun climbed high, he'd rise, bump his head against Walt's shoulder, and disappear until next time. No fanfare, no fuss, just a silent promise kept, month after month. The years etched deeper lines on Walt's face. His steps slowed. King noticed. The lion began lingering closer to the cabin, watching with those sharp eyes. Their ritual simplified, just Walt setting meat on the fence rail, King eating slowly, both stealing glances when they thought the other wasn't looking. Sometimes, after King left, Walt would find wet tracks on his cheeks. He told himself it was the mountain wind. But the old scarf, now kept in a drawer, still smelled faintly of lion. 15 winters came and went. King's muzzle grayed. Walt's back bent. Still, every few weeks, like clockwork, that deep roar would sound. The rangers took bets on who'd outlast who. Walt just smiled and kept extra meat thawing. Some things in life remain certain. The sun rising, the rivers running, and a lion's loyalty. Even when Walt's hands shook too badly to open the meat package, King waited patiently. No hurry. They had all the time in the world. Didn't they? The pain started small. A twinge when lifting supplies. Then one morning, Walt couldn't rise from bed. Outside, King's familiar roar went unanswered. The lion paced the fence line for hours, tail lashing. When young Ranger Riley finally investigated, he found Walt pale and sweating. The diagnosis came swift and cruel. Liver cancer. Advanced. As they loaded Walt into the ambulance, a sound cut through the commotion. a roar so anguished, even the medics froze. Grief, raw and primal, echoing off the mountains. The hospital walls smelled sterile. Wrong. Walt stared at the ceiling, counting cracks instead of stars. 6 weeks, the doctor said gently. Walt barely heard. His mind was miles away, on a sun-dappled fence line, where a golden-eyed king still waited. That night, he made his decision. "Take me home," he rasped. "Not to die in this white prison, but to say goodbye properly, to feel mountain air one last time, and maybe, if he was lucky, to hear that familiar roar again." Walt's voice was barely more than a whisper now, but his words carried the weight of mountains. "Under the big pine by Silver Creek," he instructed, eyes fixed on the window where the first light of dawn touched the peaks. The young rangers, tough men who faced grizzlies without flinching, found themselves swallowing hard. Riley Foster opened his mouth to argue, but Walt just smiled. "Where I found him," he added softly. No one needed to ask who him was. The stars were particularly bright the night King came back. Not his usual visit, this was different. The lion circled the empty cabin, sniffing at doors and windows, his roars growing more desperate. At the clinic where Walt lay, miles away but still within earshot of the refuge, the old ranger stirred at some unheard call. His cracked lips formed a name only he could hear. Outside, the night birds fell silent. Even the wind held its breath. Morning brought a decision. "Take him home," Dr. Simmons ordered. They carried Walt on a stretcher to the fence line where King had been waiting for 12 straight hours. The moment the lion saw that frail figure wrapped in blankets, something broke inside him. A sound emerged. Not a roar, not a whimper, but something in between. Walt's trembling hand reached out. King pressed against the fence until the wires groaned. And there, in that golden autumn light, time stood still for them both. The Rangers will tell you about this moment until their own voices fail. How Walt's paper-thin skin met weathered whiskers through the fence links. How King closed his eyes as if memorizing the touch. How Walt whispered something that made the great lion's ears flatten in grief. No one heard the words, but Riley Foster, wiping his own eyes unashamedly, would later swear the old man said simply, "You were the best thing that ever happened to me." Then the hand fell still. The mountain air was crisp that afternoon. Some say it was the perfect day to say goodbye. Walt Mitchell took one final look at his lion, at the golden trees, at the refuge that had been his life's work. His chest rose, fell, and didn't rise again. But here's what matters. He went with his fingers tangled in golden fur, with King's scent filling his lungs, and with the quiet certainty that somewhere, somehow, this wouldn't truly be the end. Not for souls like theirs. They buried Walt under the big pine by Silver Creek, just as he'd asked. The Rangers built a cairn of smooth stones from the creek bed. Someone nailed up a simple sign, "Walter Mitchell, Keeper of the Wild." The ceremony ended. People left. But if anyone had stayed just a little longer, they might have seen shadow move between the trees. Might have heard the soft crunch of pine needles under massive paws. The story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 3 days after the burial, fresh tracks appeared around Walt's grave. Deep, purposeful impressions in the soft dirt. The Rangers found tufts of tawny fur caught on the cairn stones. And if they noticed the way the meat they'd left out for King went untouched that week, they didn't mention it. Some hungers can't be satisfied by food. Some losses cut too deep even for a lion's proud heart to bear. The seasons changed. Snow came and went. But every few weeks, like clockwork, someone would spot King lying motionless beside Walt's grave. Not sleeping, not eating, just being there. The Rangers started leaving an old red plaid scarf draped over the cairn. The same one Walt had used to wipe King's face years before. It always disappeared, only to reappear neatly folded days later. No one knew how. No one asked. Years passed. King's mane grew whiter, his steps slower. But still he came. Winter or summer, rain or shine, that majestic figure could be seen keeping vigil by the pine tree. The new generation of Rangers, who'd never even met Walt, learned to speak in hushed tones when passing the grave. Some things transcend time. Some bonds outlast even death itself. The old-timers would just nod knowingly. That's not a wild animal. That's a widower. On the 5th anniversary of Walt's passing, the rangers installed a bench by the gravesite. Not for tourists, not for show, but for King. That winter, when a blizzard buried the refuge under 3 feet of snow, young Ranger Jess Mueller swore she saw 2 shapes sitting there together, one broad-shouldered and indistinct, the other unmistakably leonine. When she blinked, only King remained. But the seat beside him, the seat bore no snow at all, as if someone or something had been keeping it warm. They say animals don't grieve. Tell that to King. The great lion stopped roaring after Walt died. His visits to the grave grew longer, quieter. Rangers would find him with his massive head resting on the cairn stones, eyes half closed as if listening to some voice only he could hear. The old scarf disappeared one winter night, just vanished from the bench. Next morning, they found it carefully draped across Walt's headstone, smelling faintly of lion musk and something else, something suspiciously like salt water. The regulars at Moose Jaw Diner would see Walt's empty booth sometimes and fall silent. Old men who'd spent lifetimes working the land would stare into their coffee, remembering. A dog that waited years for its master. A Mustang that kept returning to an empty corral. Love doesn't come with conditions. Not real love. And loyalty? That's not something you can train into a creature. It either lives in their bones, or it doesn't. King's bones knew. Spring came late the year King stopped visiting. Rangers searched the territory for weeks before finding him, lying peaceful under Walt's pine, as if he'd simply curled up for a nap. His great head rested on the cairn, one paw outstretched toward the engraved stone. Dr. Simmons said his heart just stopped. No wounds, no struggle, like he'd decided his work was done. They buried him right there beside Walt, adding a second line to the marker. And King, who kept the promise. There's a particular kind of knowing that comes with age. The women at the Refuge Volunteer Center, grandmothers mostly, understood something the young rangers didn't. They'd bring wildflowers to the graves every Sunday. Not because they believed in ghosts, but because they recognized a love story when they saw one. Not romance, something deeper. The kind of devotion that outlasts flesh and bone. The kind we all hope to give and to receive. Walt's cedar cabin stands empty now, preserved exactly as he left it. If you visit on a quiet afternoon, you might see it, that faded red scarf hanging by the door, stirring in some unfelt breeze. The park superintendent tried to remove it once for cleaning. The next morning, it was back on its hook, smelling faintly of pine and something wild. These days, they just let it be. Some things aren't meant to be tidied away. Some memories demand to breathe. Even now, veteran rangers swear they've seen them. 2 shadows moving through the mist at dawn, one tall and straight, the other low and powerful. They appear most often on the anniversary of Walt's passing, walking the old patrol route together before vanishing near Silver Creek. The new recruits roll their eyes until they see it for themselves, until they feel that inexplicable warmth in the air, hear that contented sigh of wind through pines that sounds almost like a lion's purr. The Refuge newsletter still runs Walt and King's story every Christmas. Visitors leave small tokens at the grave's polished stones, wild berries, sometimes a child's drawing of a smiling man and his lion. The old-timers tell it best, their voices catching at the same parts every time. But here's the truth no one says aloud. This isn't really an ending. Because love like theirs, that doesn't fade. It just changes form. Like mist, like memory, like the echo of a roar across the valley at dawn. There's a lesson in Walt and King's story that no textbook can teach. It's in the way King's ears would perk at Walt's footsteps, years after being released. In how Walt's gruff voice would soften when saying the lion's name. They looked at each other and saw something worth saving. Something worth coming home to. In a world that measures love in years, theirs was measured in moments, and yet, somehow it became timeless. That's not animal instinct. That's something far more rare. That's choice. The silver-haired ladies at the Black Pine Visitor Center know something scientists don't. They'll point to the photo on the wall, Walt scratching King's chin through the fence, and say, "See how his eyes are closed? That's trust." They understand the courage it takes to love something that can't promise you tomorrow, to care for a creature that might leave without warning. These women, who've buried husbands and raised children and survived losses too deep for words, they recognize a kindred spirit when they see one. If you listen closely at Walt's gravesite on still evenings, you might hear it. Not a roar, not a human voice, but something in between, a harmony of wind and memory that sounds suspiciously like laughter. The rangers don't maintain the site much anymore. The wildflowers grow unusually vibrant there. The pine needles form perfect circles around the stones. And sometimes, just sometimes, visitors swear they see two sets of footprints in the morning dew, one boot-shaped, one paw leading away together into the mist.